Goody, goody, yum, yum.
3 years before Monty Python's Flying Circus ever reached a screen, 2 future goodies and 2 future Pythons were already appearing together in the same BBC sketch series, and almost every episode of it has since been wiped. The trail behind the goodies is littered with things like this: abandoned titles, erased programs, and second careers that quietly outlived the show itself.
Loyal kinsman, Lord Timothy Le Goody of London Town. Confused again.
Fact 1. Super Chaps 3. The name that ended up painted on the side of the most famous bicycle in British comedy was not the first choice. When the idea was taken to the BBC at the end of the 1960s, the working title was Super Chaps 3. It is an oddly revealing name. It tells you that the trio were not thinking about a sketch show at all, but about something closer to a comic strip adventure, serial 3 heroes, one office, a new mission every week, and a story that ran from beginning to end rather than stopping every 3 minutes for a punchline. The comic book flavour survived into the programme long after the title was dropped. The bright primary colours, the daft costumes, the sense that each episode was a small film rather than a collection of gags. The replacement did a very specific job. The goodies carried the schoolyard sense of goodies and baddies, which suited a show about 3 men who insisted on being on the side of right while behaving appallingly. It also worked as an ordinary English word for treats, sweets, presents, nice things. It was a title a child could understand instantly and an adult could smile at, which turned out to describe the audience almost exactly. What did not change was the promise underneath it. Whatever they called themselves, the offer was the same, and it remains one of the great comic premises in television. 3 men who will do anything, anytime.
Oh, bye-bye! Where's he going? He's away, he's on a trip.
Fact 2. The Lost Python crossover. Long before either team had a program of its own, the men who would become the goodies and the men who would become Monty Python were already working in the same rooms. In 1967, some of them appeared in the same series. The program was called Twice a Fortnight. It was a BBC sketch show, and its cast brought together Graeme Garden and Bill Oddie with Terry Jones and Michael Palin, alongside Jonathan Lynn, who would later co-write Yes, Minister. There was a house band, there was a great deal of noise, and by most accounts, it was a chaotic, uneven half-hour that never quite settled into a shape. 2 years later, Jones and Palin were making Monty Python's Flying Circus. A year after that, Garden and Oddie were making The Goodies. 2 of the most influential comedy series in British television history grew out of the same brief, messy experiment, and hardly anybody has ever been able to watch it. Twice a Fortnight fell victim to the BBC's tape-wiping era. When videotape was expensive, archives were treated as storage rather than history, and recordings were routinely erased so the tape could be used again. Only fragments are known to survive. It is a strange thought for anyone who has ever argued about which team was funnier. The rivalry that British comedy fans have conducted for half a century began with the 2 camps standing in the same studio on the same programme, and the evidence has almost entirely been destroyed. Fact 3. The dry run vanished. Twice a Fortnight was not the only piece of goodies prehistory to disappear. Between it and the show itself came a second series that functions, in hindsight, as an unmistakable dress rehearsal. It too was largely wiped. Broaden Your Mind arrived on BBC Two in 1968, carrying the marvellous subtitle An Encyclopedia of the Air. The format was a mock informational programme, sketches disguised as educational items, delivered with the straight face of a public service broadcast. Tim Brooke-Taylor and Graeme Garden fronted it. Bill Oddie, who had been contributing material, joined them properly for the second series. Anyone who knows the goodies will recognise the ingredients at once. The deadpan parody of authority, the willingness to build an entire sequence out of one absurd premise, and above all, the specific chemistry of those 3 particular men in a room together, all of it being assembled in public, on a minority channel, in front of a comparatively small audience. The moment the three of them were on screen together, the shape of what came next was obvious. Within a year, they were making their own program, and within 2, they were pulling audiences that Broaden Your Mind could never have dreamed of. Then the tapes went. Only a small number of complete editions are known to have survived, which means the last rehearsal before one of Britain's most watched comedy series is now largely a matter of description rather than viewing. The goodies did not arrive fully formed out of nowhere. The proof simply no longer exists.
Before the infinitely more subtle and superior Lancastrian martial art of what I happen to be a master.
You are.
Oh, yes, I am.
Fact 4. Garden qualified as doctor. Of the 3 men wobbling about on the trandom, one held a professional qualification with nothing whatever to do with comedy. Graeme Garden is a doctor. He read medicine at Cambridge and completed his clinical training in London, coming out of the far end fully qualified. Then, having done every bit of it, he went into television instead and never took up practice in any sustained way. It is one of the more remarkable career decisions in British light entertainment. Years of medical training, completed to the letter, and then quietly set aside for a job that would eventually involve a giant kitten. The training was not wasted, because it went directly into the work. The mad scientist strand of the goodies, the contraptions, the experiments. The man in the white coat, explaining something that is very obviously about to go wrong, was written by the one member of the team who had genuinely stood in laboratories and understood what he was parodying. The jokes land harder because the person making them knew exactly which corner of the science he was bending. It also gave the trio an unusual balance. One of them was a trained doctor, one was a serious musician and naturalist, and one was a classically skilled comic performer. 3 entirely different competencies pointed at the same daft target, and the qualification never quite went away. Long after the show ended, Garden was still being invited onto programs to talk about medicine and science as somebody who actually knew the subject, rather than somebody reading an autocue. British comedy is full of performers who play clever. He was one of the few who had the paperwork. Fact 5. They wrote doctor sitcoms. Garden's medical training had a second life that most viewers never connected to the goodies at all. He and Bill Oddie were among the writers on the Doctor sitcoms, the long-running ITV comedies that began with Doctor in the House at the end of the 1960s. The writing room on those series is one of the most extraordinary assemblies in British comedy history. Alongside Garden and Oddie sat names that would define the following decade in entirely different directions, including John Cleese and Graham Chapman, and Chapman, like Garden, was a qualified doctor who had chosen comedy instead. That is 2 medically trained men writing hospital comedy for a mass ITV audience at the exact moment they were both about to become famous for something else entirely. The Doctor series ran and ran, spinning off sequel after sequel, and it kept a generation of comic writers in steady work while their own shows were still ideas in a drawer. It is worth pausing on how small the world was. The same few dozen people, mostly out of the same university reviews, wrote nearly everything funny on British television for the best part of 15 years. They swapped shows, borrowed each other's rejects, and turned up in each other's casts. The goodies did not emerge from a vacuum. They emerged from a very crowded, very talented room. If you're enjoying this, it would mean a lot if you subscribed. It helps us keep making videos like this one. Just hit that button and you'll never miss a new one.
Before the infinitely more subtle and superior Lancastrian martial art.
Fact 6. 2 men wrote it. The goodies looked like the work of 3 equal partners, and in performance it was. On the page it was not. The scripts were the work of Graeme Garden and Bill Oddie. Tim Brooke-Taylor was the performer of the 3, and an exceptionally fine one, but the writing partnership at the centre of the show was a pair, not a trio. Garden and Oddie had been writing together since their university days, and they arrived at the goodies with a shared shorthand already years old. This is a more delicate arrangement than it sounds. 2 men write a character for a third man to play, week after week, for a decade. The version of Tim on screen, the flag-waving patriot, the fuss spot, the one most likely to burst into tears about the Queen, was written for him rather than by him, and he then had to inhabit it completely. That he did so without visible friction says a great deal about all three. Plenty of comedy teams have broken apart over precisely this: who writes, who performs, whose name is on the script, and who gets the credit when it works. The Goodies ran for series after series, and the partnership held. It also explains something about the show's texture. The writing has a particular density, gags stacked on gags, visual ideas that must have been agony to stage, which is what happens when two writers who trust each other completely stop worrying about whether anything is achievable. Fact 7. Australia never let go. While the BBC was quietly leaving the Goodies on a shelf, an entire country on the other side of the world was doing the opposite. In Australia, the series became something close to a national institution. It was broadcast and rebroadcast on the ABC for years, in slots where children could find it, and it embedded itself in Australian childhoods to a degree that surprises even British fans who thought they knew how popular the show had been. The result was a peculiar imbalance. In Britain, an entire generation grew up having heard of the Goodies without ever having seen a full episode. In Australia, the same generation could quote them line for line. Ask an Australian of a certain age about Ecky Thump, and you will not need to explain the reference. The trio noticed, and eventually they went. Decades after the last episode was made, the Goodies played live to Australian audiences, theatres full of grown adults who had waited half their lives to see three men they had loved as children and who greeted them like returning heroes. There is a lesson in it about how television actually survives. A program does not endure because critics approve of it, or because it wins prizes, or because the institution that made it decides to be proud of it. It endures because somebody, somewhere, keeps putting it on at the time of day when children are watching. Australia did that for years, and it bought the Goodies an entire second audience. For a team that had been treated as an embarrassment by their own broadcaster, it must have been an extraordinary corrective. The show never really died. It simply emigrated and thrived somewhere the schedulers could not reach it. Fact 8. Bananaman reunited the three. After the ITV series ended in the early 1980s, the Goodies never made another television series together. But all three of them worked together again almost immediately, and millions of children heard it without ever knowing. The program was Bananaman, the animated series adapted from the British comic strip about a boy who eats a banana and becomes a spectacularly incompetent superhero. Tim Brooke-Taylor, Graeme Garden, and Bill Oddie provided the voices. It ran through the middle of the decade in short, sharp episodes, and it became a fixture of children's television in exactly the years when the Goodies themselves had vanished from the schedules. There is a whole cohort of British adults who grew up with all three Goodies in their living room every week and had no idea at all. The material suited them perfectly. Bananaman is built on the same joke the Goodies had been telling for a decade: heroic posturing undermined by total incompetence, and the vocal performances have the same relish for silliness, played absolutely straight. It is a quietly poignant footnote. The trio were still working, still funny, still together in a recording booth at the precise moment the country had been told they were finished. They had simply been moved to a smaller room. Fact 9. Clue outlasted the Goodies. The Goodies ran for roughly 12 years. The radio program that two of them joined has now been running for more than 50. I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue began on BBC Radio in the early 1970s as a spin-off from the radio show where the three of them had originally met. It bills itself as the antidote to panel games, and its glory is that the games are deliberately impossible rounds with no discernible rules, points awarded arbitrarily, and a scoreboard nobody takes seriously. Tim Brooke-Taylor and Graeme Garden became fixtures of it. Brooke-Taylor stayed with the program for very nearly the whole of the rest of his life, which means he spent decades longer as a Clue panelist than he ever spent as a Goodie. This is the part of the story that television audiences tend to miss entirely. For British radio listeners, Brooke-Taylor and Garden were never nostalgia acts. They were current, working comedians who turned up every week, sang Mornington Crescent's praises, and made a national audience laugh long after the Trandom had been retired. The show they made together in the 1970s made them famous. The show, two of them joined on the radio, kept them company for the next 50 years. Fact 10. The boy with binoculars. Long before he was a goodie, and long before he was one of Britain's best-known naturalists, Bill Oddie was a boy who went looking for birds because there was not much else to do. His childhood was difficult in ways he would only describe publicly much later. His mother was seriously unwell and spent long periods in institutions, and he was raised largely by his grandmother. Birdwatching was, by his own account, an escape, something reliable and absorbing and entirely his own, in a childhood that offered very little of any of the three. It never left him. Even at the height of the goodies, Oddie was a serious birder rather than a celebrity with a hobby, and by the start of the 1980s, he was publishing books about it. Decades later, when he became the face of British wildlife broadcasting, the audience assumed a comedian had taken up a new subject. He had not. He had simply gone back to the thing he had been doing since he was small. There is something quietly moving about that when you rewatch the show. The most anarchic of the three, the one written as the scruffy troublemaker who would start a fight with anybody, was in private the one who could sit perfectly still in a cold field for hours, waiting for something small to land. The comedy was the loud part. The patience was always underneath it.